I should have known better than to mess with places like St. Helena's. But how could I have predicted what was coming? It all started as a college trip, a weekend escape from midterms and deadlines, a thrill to break up the monotony of campus life. I had always been drawn to horror and haunted legends, but never in a million years did I think I'd find myself on the wrong side of one. The journey started that Friday morning. We piled into my car, everyone buzzing with excitement and nerves, sharing spooky stories to set the tone. Mike, as usual, was the loudest of us, his laugh echoing over the rumble of the road. Trevor, his best friend since middle school, was quieter but shot back sarcastic comments whenever Mike got too cocky. Sarah sat in the middle, absorbing everything with wide eyes. She was always the most intuitive, and I think she could sense something was off even before we arrived. Chloe was skeptical as always, rolling her eyes when we mentioned ghosts, but still there for the thrill. The church wasn't even on the map. We'd heard about it through a few friends, and rumors had circled around campus for years. An abandoned church, St. Helena's, deep in rural Louisiana, supposedly the site of a botched exorcism. A priest had tried to expel a demon from a young boy, and the story went that something went terribly wrong. People claimed that the priest and boy disappeared, that they were swallowed up by the church walls themselves. It sounded ridiculous, but the allure of uncovering a place shrouded in mystery was too tempting. The closer we got, the more the air thickened, almost as if we were entering a different world. I told myself it was just anticipation, but in retrospect, it was something far more sinister. The church appeared almost out of nowhere, looming in the distance, wrapped in shadows and silence. The white paint had faded into a sickly gray, peeling off the wooden frame like dead skin. Vines strangled the walls, crawling over the windows, almost like the earth itself was trying to pull it back into the ground. Around it sprawled an overgrown graveyard, broken stones half hidden in weeds, tilting as if they were sinking. We set up our tents just outside the church grounds, close enough to catch sight of the building but far enough to feel like we had some buffer. I didn't admit it then, but even in broad daylight, the place felt off, as though it had been waiting for us. Still, we laughed it off, dragging out our camping gear, joking that this would be just another scary story to tell on Monday. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply, turning the air icy. It made me pull my jacket tighter around me, shivering, but I wasn't the only one. The others kept looking over their shoulders, glancing nervously at the church, its shadow stretching out in the moonlight, casting strange shapes that looked like grasping hands. Around the campfire, Trevor shared his own twist on the legend, a story he'd heard from his grandmother, who grew up nearby. "They say the priest's soul is trapped here," he muttered, his face flickering in the firelight. He was so desperate to save that boy, but whatever was inside, it took him too. My grandma says if you listen carefully, you can still hear him scratching inside the walls. Sarah shuddered and pulled her knees to her chest. "Stop it, Trevor," she whispered. But he only grinned, his face half-shadowed, his eyes glinting in the firelight. I laughed, trying to break the tension, but it sounded hollow. The stories clawed at the back of my mind, leaving me unsettled. Chloe stayed silent, but her gaze kept drifting toward the church, as though she sensed something none of us could see. Then we heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the direction of the church. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be an animal. We fell silent, straining to hear, our laughter forgotten. The scratching grew louder, echoing in the stillness, seeming to reverberate through the night. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, my heart pounding as I looked around, but no one dared move. After a few moments, the sound faded, leaving us in an uneasy silence. We exchanged nervous glances, each of us waiting for someone else to break the spell. Finally, Mike laughed, though it sounded forced. "All right, which one of you planned this?" he asked, but his voice shook. None of us responded. We huddled closer around the fire, trying to convince ourselves that it was just the wind, just our minds playing tricks on us. But that night, the dream started. Sarah was the first. She woke up in a panic, gasping for air, her eyes wide and terrified. I saw him," she whispered, clutching her sleeping bag like a lifeline. "The priest. He was being dragged, his nails scraping against the walls, screaming for help. But there was no one. We tried to calm her down, but her fears seeped into us, making us uneasy. I closed my eyes, hoping to get some sleep, but the image of a shadowy figure, hands clawing at unseen walls, lingered in my mind, keeping me on edge. The next day, we explored the church. The inside was colder, darker than I expected, even with daylight streaming in through cracks in the boarded windows. Dust hung thick in the air, covering everything in a layer of decay, and the smell, something between mildew and old wood, clung to my clothes, sinking into my skin. We wandered through the narrow aisles, our footsteps echoing in the hollow space. As we passed the altar, I caught a glimpse of something strange, a faint, flickering light behind the boarded-up windows. I called the others over, and we stared at it, wondering if it was a trick of the light. But then it moved, shifting from one side to the other, as if someone or something was watching us. We left quickly after that, our nerves fraying, unable to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Nightfall brought the fog, thick and suffocating, wrapping around us like a shroud. We huddled around the campfire, but even the fire's warmth couldn't dispel the cold creeping over us. Mike and Trevor tried to lighten the mood, making jokes about church ghosts, but the laughter felt forced, thin against the silence pressing in on us. Then around midnight we heard it again, a voice, low and guttural, whispering from the direction of the church. This time it was calling Mike's name. He froze, glancing around with wide eyes, a nervous smile playing on his lips. "Very funny, guys. Who's got the speaker?" None of us had. The voice kept calling, soft but insistent, growing louder. Against my better judgment, Mike stood up, mumbling something about proving it was all a joke, and walked toward the church. We watched, paralyzed by fear, as he disappeared into the fog. Minutes stretched into eternity, each one heavier than the last. Finally, Trevor, Chloe, and I went after him, our flashlights slicing through the mist. Inside the church, the air was thick, suffocating, pressing in around us. There, in front of the altar, was Mike standing completely still, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were glazed, empty, staring into nothing. Then he began to mutter in Latin, his voice distorted, echoing through the empty space. I didn't understand the words, but I knew they weren't his. Chloe screamed, stumbling back, while Sarah clutched my arm, her grip tight and desperate. I could feel something dark, ancient, wrapping around us, as though the church itself were alive, drawing us into its curse. I realized in that moment that we had unleashed something far worse than we could imagine. The exorcism had failed, leaving the priest and the spirit trapped here, and we had brought it back to life. I knew what I had to do. I could feel its grip on me, the darkness spreading through my mind, pulling me into memories that weren't mine. With a final act of desperation, I shouted, "Take me instead," hoping it would release the others. As the darkness closed in, I heard their voices calling my name, fading as I was pulled into the shadows, into a place beyond time, where the spirit's curse lived on. And now, when the fog rolls in, I am still here, trapped in the walls of St. Helena's, waiting for the next visitors, calling out to them in the dead of night. I still don't know why I felt compelled to visit Willow Creek Church that night. Maybe it was the thrill of experiencing something out of the ordinary, the kind of story you'd tell in whispers years later, a story that kept listeners up at night. It was supposed to be just another adventure. I'd heard the rumors, of course, how the church had been abandoned after a botched exorcism, the tragic tales of the cursed priest and the spirit he couldn't drive away. And I figured it would be an easy way to freak out my friends. It didn't take much to convince Marcus, Eliza, and Noah to join me. They were as curious and reckless as I was. The night was cold, the forest heavy with silence as we made our way to the church. Its old, decaying silhouette loomed in the moonlight, shrouded by twisted trees that almost seemed to lean in as we passed. The walls were cracked, and vines clawed their way up the stones, as if nature itself were trying to reclaim this place. But even more chilling was the strange, oppressive quiet surrounding the area. No owls hooted, no wind stirred. Just silence. My hand hovered over the old wooden door, hesitating for just a second. When I pushed it open, the door creaked, groaning like something ancient awakening. I could feel a rush of cold air seep out, like the church was exhaling after years of stillness. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but it was more than that. It felt heavy, like an unseen weight pressing down on us. The stained glass windows, covered in grime, cast murky, fractured patches of moonlight on the rotting wooden pews. And then there was the smell, a mix of mildew, stale incense, and something sharper, something that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. At the pulpit, we found an old, cracked leather diary, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The entries detailed the last days of the priest who had once served here. He described a girl from the village who was believed to be possessed. He wrote of nights spent trying to banish the spirit that tormented her, only to fail time and again. The last few pages grew increasingly chaotic, his handwriting jagged, almost violent, as he described how the demon had finally turned on him. The final entry was nothing but desperate scribbles, an illegible mess, followed by a single phrase, "I am not alone." I laughed, brushing it off, calling it some sort of sick joke. But as the sound of my own laughter echoed in the empty church, it felt wrong, mocking somehow. A chill swept over me, sharp and sudden, like fingers trailing along my spine. The flickering shadows on the walls seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, as if they were alive, dancing and twisting in patterns I couldn't quite make out. And then Marcus, who had been standing closest to the altar, suddenly dropped to his knees, his body convulsing. His eyes rolled back, and a strange, guttural mumble slipped from his lips, a sound so foreign it didn't even seem to come from him. It was deep and distorted, like something from another world. "Noah, help me!" I shouted, panic creeping into my voice as I grabbed Marcus's shoulders, shaking him, trying to snap him out of it. His skin was ice cold to the touch, and he didn't react, didn't even seem aware we were there. I glanced back at Eliza, whose face had gone pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. Eliza stumbled toward the altar, grabbing an old, dusty crucifix that lay among the debris. "Hold him still," she cried, pressing the crucifix to Marcus's forehead. Her voice was shaking as she muttered a prayer, her words slipping into a desperate whisper. I could feel Marcus's body tense under my hands, his muscles locking up. He let out a guttural growl, a low, menacing sound that made my stomach turn. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, his body went limp, collapsing forward, gasping for breath. But when he looked up at us, something was wrong. His eyes, they weren't his eyes. There was a darkness there, something ancient and malevolent lurking beneath the surface. "Marcus?" I whispered, but he didn't respond. He only stared, that strange smile spreading across his face, his lips twisting in a way that was anything but human. And then he whispered, his voice layered, a sinister echo, "You can't get rid of me." The words cut through me like a knife. I wanted to run, to get as far from that place as possible, but I couldn't move, paralyzed by the sheer terror of the moment. Noah grabbed my arm, snapping me out of it, and together, we pulled Marcus to his feet. Eliza was already at the door, her eyes wide and filled with tears. We stumbled out of the church, our footsteps echoing in the night as we fled through the trees. But even as we left, I could feel it, a presence, something that watched us from the shadows. The forest seemed darker, colder, as if it too were haunted by whatever we'd awakened in that church. And then there was Marcus. The entire way back, he remained silent, his expression vacant, though his eyes never quite looked the same. I kept seeing that twisted smile, that look of someone else staring back at me. The next few days were a blur of denial, nightmares, and uneasy silence between the four of us. I tried to forget, tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, an illusion brought on by fear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't come back alone. It was a week later when I noticed the changes in Marcus. He'd always been the joker of the group, but now he was different. He spoke in clipped, unsettling tones, his gaze distant and cold. And at night, I'd catch him staring at nothing, his lips moving as if whispering to someone just out of sight. One night, I found him standing in my doorway, watching me sleep. His face was pale, his eyes empty, that familiar twisted smile on his lips. "I told you," he murmured, his voice layered with that same sinister echo. "You can't get rid of me." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I closed my eyes, willing the nightmare to end, and when I opened them, he was gone. But the feeling stayed, lingering like a stain. No matter what I did, no matter how far I tried to run, I knew it was only a matter of time before it came back for me, just like it had for him. They say some places hold on to the dead, places where the walls remember, where shadows keep secrets that shouldn't be disturbed. And I know now that Willow Creek Church is one of them, a place where the veil between the living and the dead has worn dangerously thin. And as I sit here, writing this, my hand trembles because I know, I can feel it, that something is watching me from the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to take me too.